Welcome to Dieu Han, wishing you peace, strength, and good health wherever you are. Today's story reveals the quiet sorrow of a man who has always loved in silence. Thanh, gentle and kind, carries storms deep within. On the surface, he's steady. But inside, his heart still echoes with wounds that time could never heal. And when someone from his past unexpectedly returns, everything he thought he had buried rises once more. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your country. We're grateful to have you with us today. Stories like this one remind us how the quietest hearts often carry the loudest battles. And Dieu Han's story may be the one you relate to more than you expect. Thanh's love for Dieu Han was never loud. It lived in the meals he prepared, the paths he quietly cleared, the silences he never tried to fill. He never demanded, never reached beyond what she was ready to give. His love was patience, presence, and quiet devotion. But when a ghost from the past suddenly returns, the calm life he built begins to tremble. Every wall he raised to protect his heart starts to crack, and feelings he buried long ago slowly begin to surface. It was a man Thanh had once called his brother. Someone who had walked beside him through years of friendship, laughter, and silent loyalty. But something had torn that bond apart long ago, a betrayal, a truth too heavy to carry. Now, standing face to face again, the past came rushing back like a wave. Thanh's breath caught in his chest. His heart didn't just remember the pain. It remembered the trust, the warmth, and everything that was lost in a single moment. Then stood frozen, caught between memory and disbelief. Inside him, fragments clashed, late-night conversations, a bond once unbreakable, and the silence that followed like a shadow. This wasn't just someone from his past, it was the man who once knew his soul better than anyone. But time had twisted closeness into distance. Now, they stood like strangers in familiar skin. The years had changed everything, yet in that moment, Thanh felt as though no time had passed at all. He wanted to speak, but something heavy pressed against his chest. Words gathered, but none escaped. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind. Was that regret in the man's eyes? Or guilt, or sorrow too old to name? Thanh's heart faltered. Could forgiveness really survive years of silence and hurt? Could two people, once so close, find their way back after everything was lost? He didn't know, but in that moment, he knew one thing: some wounds still waited for answers. This story is far from over. What happened between these two men? And how will this reunion affect Thanh's path? And maybe even Dieu Han's life? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Dieu Han RV, and hit the bell so you never miss what happens next. Their past is only beginning to resurface. The moment Thanh saw him, something inside cracked. The years didn't matter, time didn't soften the memory. That jawline, that uneven step, the way his eyes dodged everything but truth, it all struck at once. No name was needed. Thanh's heart had already whispered it. Lam, the man who once stood beside him like a brother, then disappeared into silence. He had trusted him with everything, and in return, all he got was an empty space where trust used to live. His breath faltered. The last time they spoke, hope was a fragile thing clinging to a failed investment, to promises made in panic. Lam had sworn to keep the little they had left safe, and then he vanished. Days turned into weeks, and hope curdled into something darker. Thanh didn't just lose money, he lost the one person he never thought would walk away. It wasn't the betrayal that hurt most, it was how quietly Lam disappeared. Like their years of brotherhood meant nothing. Thanh still remembered the room Lam left behind: bare walls, unreturned calls, lies dressed as silence. There were no goodbyes, no explanations, just absence. And Thanh, too ashamed to tell anyone, carried it all like a wound stitched shut. For years, he told himself to forget, to move on. But wounds don't vanish. They wait, and now, that waiting stood inches away, breathing, blinking, pretending nothing had ever gone wrong. His fists curled slowly, not out of rage, but memory. Lam didn't look ashamed. If anything, he wore time like armor, older, steadier, untouched by the wreckage he left behind. But Thanh hadn't moved on, not truly. The silence had followed him everywhere, like a ghost he never buried. And now, facing Lam again, he felt like a man standing at the edge of a grave he thought was long sealed. Lam's eyes held nothing Thanh could name. No guilt, no sorrow, not even apology. Just a quiet gaze that stirred more rage than comfort. If he had come to say sorry, he was late by years, and if not, then what was he here for? Than's pulse pounded with every question left to rot in the dark. This wasn't closure, this was reopening a wound with bare hands. Memories swarmed him, nights spent planning dreams, laughter shared over cheap meals, hopes that once felt unshakable. And Lam had walked away from all of it, like it was disposable. Then didn't just feel betrayed, he felt erased. And now, with Lam standing before him, the ache returned not as pain, but as something worse, memory with no place to go. Then didn't move, couldn't, his body trembled under the weight of things too long buried. He wanted to hit Lam, or hug him, or turn and run, but he did nothing. Just stood there, watching a ghost pretend to be real again. Some part of him still wanted answers. Another part knew he'd never get them. That was the tragedy. Not that Lam left, but that they never got to understand why. Some wounds don't need more time, they need truth. Ten didn't crave revenge, he wasn't that man anymore. What he needed was clarity. Why wasn't there bond enough to hold Lam back? Why did loyalty mean so little when it mattered most? Without those answers, Ten knew the past would never truly let him go. Healing didn't come from forgetting, it came from understanding. And right now, the silence between them was the only thing speaking. He turned away, not because he was finished, but because he finally understood holding on wouldn't bring peace. The past had already taken enough. Every step he took now was a quiet defiance, a soft refusal to be owned by hurt. Lam's eyes followed, heavy with something unspoken, but then didn't look back. Whatever answers he needed, they would come later or not at all. What mattered was the life ahead, not the shadow left behind. Some ghosts never leave, they stay in the corners of memory, waiting. But Tan was no longer the boy who waited too. He had become someone who could stand, even when shaking. His scars were still there, but they no longer ruled him. Maybe forgiveness would come, maybe not. The Tan had looked his past in the eye and chosen not to break. And sometimes, that quiet choice is the loudest victory of all. There was a time when Tan, Lam, and a girl were inseparable. They weren't just friends, they were a unit. Bound by dreams and reckless youth, together, they chased sunsets, built castles out of hopes, and leaned on each other through storms no one else could see. She had a smile that softened even Lam's edges. And then he never missed how Lam's eyes lingered on her a little longer than they should. It was a quiet evening. In a riverside cafe they all loved, Lam had left early. She stayed behind, fingers curled around a warm cup, eyes lost in something far away. Then sat across from her, watching the storm behind her silence, and then she sighed. A soft, trembling sound that held more truth than words ever could. In that breath, Then felt the shift like something sacred had quietly cracked. That night, she told Then she had feelings for Lam. She wasn't sure if it was love, or if it was return. She only knew it was there, quietly growing. Then listened. He didn't flinch, but inside, something splintered. He had loved her too quietly, selfishly. But he buried it all for the sake of what they had. And that night, with one confession, something between them faded into silence. They never spoke of it again. She smiled the next day like nothing had changed. Lam never brought her up. But something had shifted, subtle at first, like wine moving through leaves. The trio stopped meeting as often, the jokes grew forced. Then felt the distance creeping in, slow and steady. So when Lam proposed the investment plan, Then said yes, not for money, but for the chance to hold on to something that was already slipping away. Then had hoped that building something real might bring them back. That shared work could replace faded laughter. But deep down, he knew the foundation had cracked long before the money vanished. Their bond had frayed, thread by thread, each silence pulling it thinner. And in chasing that one last project, Then wasn't trying to succeed. He was trying to save the memory of who they used to be. But instead of healing, the plan shattered what was left. The deal failed, the money vanished, and Lam disappeared with it. She tried to stay in touch, her messages short and strained, but silence eventually won. Then was left with ringing phones and a hollow ache he couldn't name. It wasn't just about losing money. It was about watching two people vanish one after the other until all he had was absence. Memories of her bled into memories of betrayal. Her laughter became an echo he couldn't trust. Even her kindness, her glance toward Lam, felt stained in retrospect. Then sometimes wondered if she had known, had she suspected, and if she had warned him would it have made any difference. The past never answered. It only whispered regrets in the quietest corners of the night. Years passed, then forced life into motion. He worked harder, smiled more, let new people in. But every so often, a passing perfume or a certain laugh will undo it all. She would come rushing back, not in anger, not in grief, but in the fragile way memories return. Then realized that it had never just been Lam he lost. It was the small world they built together, a world that no longer existed. Seeing Lam again was like unlocking a door he had bolted shut. With it came dust, shadows, and questions he had buried deep. Was Lam here with news about her? Had she sent him? The thought unsettled him. Hope and dread warred quietly in his chest. He didn't know which feeling scared him more, the possibility of seeing her again, or the risk of reopening a wound that had never healed. He hated that she still lived somewhere in him, that her absence could still ache like presence. After all this time, just the thought of her could tighten his chest. Then didn't know what it was, love, guilt, or unfinished grief, but he knew this much. Lam had answers. And somewhere in those answers, Then feared there was a truth he wasn't ready to live with. Then watched Lam closely, searching the lines of his face for a map to the truth. There was something there, regret, maybe sorrow, but not once did he speak her name. Then waited, quiet, restrained. Maybe Lam was waiting too. Two men trapped in a silence that wasn't empty. It carried the weight of everything and said, everything and done. He almost asked, her name hovered on his tongue like a ghost not yet laid to rest. But pride pulled it back, then wouldn't give Lam the satisfaction of knowing how deep the scar still ran. The past had already cost him too much, his trust, his time, his peace. He wouldn't surrender his dignity too. They stood beneath the dim streetlight outside Dieu Han's gate, where memory lingered like the scent of rain. Years ago, the three of them had stood here laughing over iced coffee, tossing dreams into the sky like coins into a fountain. That night had felt infinite. Now, the same air felt foreign, as if joy had moved on and left only its shadow behind. They stood in silence once more, but this time, it wasn't the silence of avoidance, it was the silence of two men on the edge of something fragile. Not yet trust, not yet peace, just a small, uncertain space where forgiveness might begin. Whatever came next, both knew nothing between them would ever be the same again. What would you do if the person who once betrayed you returned, asking for forgiveness? Can time truly mend a wound that deep, or are some scars meant to stay? Lam's return stirred the ashes of the past, but tense silence speaks louder than 1,000 words. In his place, would you forgive? Thank you for sharing this emotional journey with us on Dieu Han. If Than's story touched something in you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. There are still truths waiting to be revealed. Your support keeps these stories alive.